Hello, welcome to the first week of this massive open online course, Introduction to PLSQL Program Units. You are viewing the third video of this week, Creating Stored Procedures. In the previous video, you learned about the subprograms, stored procedures and functions, and how they differ from an anonymous block. In this video, you will learn about the structure of a stored procedure, about the modes in which you can pass parameters, and how to create, compile, and invoke a stored procedure. As you already know, Jill developed an employee entry form in the HR administration system to add new employee records into the HR database. She also analyzed and identified that this form has to first validate the job ID. Second, if the job ID is valid, then insert a new record for the employee into the HR database. And third, if the job ID is not valid, then display an appropriate message on the screen and make an entry into the log file. Jill now knows that she can use subprograms for this purpose. She decides to create a stored procedure to insert the valid employee records in the HR database. She also plans to use the same stored procedure to write all the failed validations in a log file. Shall we look at how Jill is going to accomplish this? Jill must follow a three-step process. First, she must create a stored procedure with the required logic. Then, she must compile the stored procedure, and finally, Jill must invoke the stored procedure. Now, let us look at the stored procedure that Jill created and understand its structure. First, if you observe the stored procedure, you can notice that its structure is similar to a simple PLSQL block, the only difference being the header. Let's look at the structure of the stored procedure in detail now. The header starts with the create or replace procedure keywords followed by the procedure name and its parameters. The header determines the way the stored procedure is invoked. Second, the declarative section. The declarative section begins with the is or as keyword. All the variables, cursors, and subblocks that are referenced in the execution and exception sections are declared here. 3. The execution section. The execution section starts with the begin keyword. This block contains one or more SQL or PLSQL statements that the PLSQL engine will execute at runtime. This is a mandatory section. Number 4, the exception section. This section begins with the exception keyword. It has code to handle exceptions for normal processing, such as warnings, error messages, and so on. As you can see, Jill creates a procedure named add_employee that accepts 5 input parameters using the create or replace procedure keyword. Let's discuss about the modes of parameter passing before we proceed further. You can pass stored procedure parameters using any one of the 3 modes, that is, in, out, or in-out. A variable passed in the in mode is read-only. It is the default mode. The variable passed in the in mode can be used by stored procedures and functions but cannot be changed. In addition, it cannot be the receiver of an assignment operation. Notice that Jill passed all the parameters to the add_employee procedure as default, that is, as in parameters. A variable passed in the out mode passes information back from the stored procedure to the calling program. It is a write-only variable and has no value until the block assigns a value to it. A variable value that is passed in the in-out mode can be both read and changed by the stored procedure. The changed variable value is copied back to the passed variable when the procedure completes. Now, let us look at the declarative section of this procedure. e_invalid_job is a user-defined exception declared to raise and handle an invalid job ID. The v underscore rec underscore count is a scalar variable declared to hold the number of records defined in the jobs table for the input job ID. In the declarative section that begins with the keyword is, Jill creates two identifiers, that is, e underscore invalid underscore job and v underscore rec underscore count. The executable section begins with a select query against the jobs table to check if the input job ID is defined in the database. Following this, we have the if-then-else statement to validate the job ID based on the value returned by the select query. If it passes the validation, that is, if the job ID is valid, then new employee records are inserted into the employees table. If the control passes to the else clause, that is, if the input job ID is invalid, then the exception e underscore invalid underscore job is raised. This exception is handled in the exception section to display the message input job ID is invalid. You will learn more about exception handling in the upcoming lesson. As a second step, let's compile this procedure. To do this, click the Run button or press F5 in SQL Developer. If the code is syntactically correct, then it is compiled and the message procedure add underscore employee is compiled is displayed. Once the procedure is compiled successfully, it is stored in the database. You can view it under Procedures in the Connections pane in SQL Developer. If the procedure is compiled with errors, then the red cross mark is displayed against its name as shown on the screen. Now that the stored procedure is compiled successfully, you can invoke it as many times as you want to insert employee records in the HR administration system. You can invoke the stored procedure either from an anonymous block or from another stored procedure. Let us look at how to invoke the stored procedure from an anonymous block to enter two employee rows into the HR database. An anonymous block is a PLSQL block that is not named and is not stored in the database. In this example, the anonymous block begins with the keyword begin, followed by the stored procedure name add underscore employee. This invokes the stored procedure. The parameters employee first name, employee last name, job ID, salary, and email ID are passed. The anonymous block ends with the keyword end followed by the semicolon. Let's run this block and see the output. Notice that two messages are displayed. The input job ID for the first invocation of add underscore employee, that is st underscore rep, is invalid. Therefore, an exception is raised and the message input job ID is invalid is displayed. Because the exception is handled in the stored procedure, the execution doesn't stop abruptly and it executes the next statement in the anonymous block. As the input job ID passed in this invocation is valid, the employee row is inserted into the employees table successfully and the stored procedure completes successfully. The message PLSQL procedure successfully completed is displayed for the record that contains the valid job ID, which is SA underscore REP. Let's execute a select query on employees table to validate the inserted records. Notice that only one row with valid job ID, that is SA underscore REP, is inserted into the employees table. Let's recap what you have learned in this video. You should have learned how to create a stored procedure, the different types of parameter modes, how to compile a stored procedure, and finally, how to invoke a stored procedure. To practice what you learned, solve the assignment posted for this video on the OLL course page. Please post your questions, if any, in the course forum, whose link is shown here. Thank you for watching this video.